Molo buti,
Eweke sisi,
unjani,
siyaphila sisi, unjani wena?
siyaphile,
Ewe,
enkosi.
nam ndiyabulela.
Thank you very much for accepting the invitation to this conversation. I greeted you with my very limited isiXhosa because I know that is your first language. And I want to start with the question, what does it mean to philosophize in isiXhosa?
Thank you very much. I appreciate the fact that you greeted me in isiXhosa. That puts me at great ease. It just struck me now that a word crossed my mind which is not often associated with philosophy in our language, and yet it is. And I think that instead of isiXhosa speaking people trying to translate the word literally from English into isiXhosa, they can deal with do better with the word. We've got the word in isiXhosa, inkcuba buchopho. Now, inkcuba buchopho, of course, is a noun. It comes from the word ukuchuba buchopho, meaning that it has got to do with peeling the brain. So if you think about it deeply, ukuchuba has got to do with removing the top layer of anything. If you were, for instance, cutting an apple, you remove the cover, you would be uchuba iapple, something like that. So in this case, ukuchuba ubuchopho is to peel the brain, to remove that which is on the surface, so that you go to that which is beneath.
Thank you very much. So we will try to peel in between us now. And I wanted to ask you, you work with the concept of African Renaissance, and I wanted you to explain a bit what it means and why you use this particular concept.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that I could be wrong. There could be someone else who used the person in my knowledge and in terms of investigating the concept who used it for the first time was Cheikh Anta Diop in the African context in 1948. He was a 25-year-old young person at the time, and his article was when do we begin to speak of an African Renaissance? Cheikh Anta Diop at that time came to the conclusion that there can be no African Renaissance to speak of until everything that is intellectual is done in African languages. So he said that without languages, no African Renaissance. And I guess when Cheikh Anta Diop was raising that point, using that word specifically, African Renaissance, he himself was cognizant of the fact that it had been used before. And you will see that I think in 1870 or so earlier, I could be wrong about the date, but Edward Blyden was one of the thinkers, used the word regeneration, and it was in English. And so you would see that this really means in the context where African people had been colonized and everything was taken away from them. So the African Renaissance basically then refers to rebirth of the reclamation of the heritage of the African people, politically, socially, economically, spiritually, in every aspect of their lives. So it is in that context that I speak about the African Renaissance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. And earlier we talked in depth about your teaching practices. And one of the questions raised was why you prefer Re-Africanization to Africanization. Maybe you could reiterate this argument as well.
For sure. I often say that I borrowed the term Re-Africanization from Amilcar Cabral, one of the revolutionary intellectuals of our times who was assassinated in 1973. So I don't remember whether the Cabral explained the concept then, but it stuck in my mind in the same way that Walter Rodney, when he speaks to about the independence movement, in Africa from the 50s, he doesn't speak about the gaining of independence. He speaks about the regaining of independence. So in this context, therefore, the term Re-Africanization basically is more effective for those of us who are in the quest for the African Renaissance, because it tells that we are in a movement that seeks to reclaim all that is ours, including the intellectual heritage. Because when some people here are speaking about Africanization, there is a misconception that we want to take that which is European and that which is Asian and to give it an African garb. But our argument is that, Africa has enough in a history, in a heritage that is worthy to be reclaimed and to be redeveloped for the present. Mm-hmm. And one of them, of course, when one looks at the history of Kemet, which is ancient Egypt, we see that ancient Egypt was very advanced, not only at the level of philosophy, but also was advanced in terms of mathematics, engineering, technology, and all of that. So that when we speak about the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education and the reclamation, we then are able to confidently say we are basically re-Africanizing and not taking that which is alien to us and trying to give it an African garb.
Yeah, thank you very much. And you already mentioned your teaching on Kemet. Could you say a bit more what you are teaching your students and maybe even how they react to this?
Well, one of the concerns that is expressed continuously since, in fact, 1995, when one vice chancellor at Wits University, deputy vice chancellor at Wits University, Malekgopolo Makgoba, called for Africanization of education. There was a recurring question, that being that, firstly, there was a statement that if there was a move towards Africanizing education, it was going to be lowering of international standards. Because the concept of a university is perceived by those as European, and therefore there is nothing such as an African university. So if you want to Africanize, it means then that you are going to drop the standards. And so the concern at all times when Makgoba emerged with this was, how then will the product of an African university compare to those of, an international, in this case, meant Europe and America. So they wanted to understand, how then is this going to be? So it was the same. It's often the same when I speak then about these concepts. The students are always interested. How are their education going to be, acceptable by international standards? And also, when then I point out to them that in fact it's on record, Tildesley is one of those who states it, but of course before him, it was before her. It was stated by George James in his 1954 book, and George James says that in the ancient world, just as today some reputable universities in the West are the go-tos for students from the whole world, at the time, in the ancient times, the institutions of Kemet were the go-tos. They were the international universities at the time. So therefore, international is not synonymous with Europe or America. International is, synonymous exactly with that. What it is international. So students get surprised because, like me and those who came before me, when we studied history in our institutions, we studied the history of Europe, or whenever we studied any so-called African history, it was the history of Europeans in Africa. And if anything, they were making reference to our kings and all of that. It was mainly to condemn them and to show how primitive they were.
Thank you very much. With my last question, I will take you off the context of South Africa and bring you here to Hildesheim, because at our center we are very concerned with the imbalances in contemporary philosophy regarding language representation, but also the representation of different world regions, for instance, but also of gender. And I was wanting to ask you now, what would be your ideas to tackle these challenges?
I don't know, but the best way for me to do this has been to look at things in a historical context to begin with, and to look at the history that women have played, not only in the African context but in the world context, so as to, on the one hand, show how women have been deliberately marginalized by societies, and why it is very important, therefore, to make a conscious decision to center them, and to show in the African context how women have played a central role, and why, therefore, it is invalid to claim that this has not happened before in history. So in the context of gender, then we do it that way. But also, I have I'll share this with you later. I have written that when I was the editor of the International Journal of African Renaissance Studies, I went out of my way to ensure, and sometimes I would have. I recall that at one stage I had 5 authors who were women in the journal itself, in the issue itself, and only 2 males. So there's got to be a conscious kind of exercise to do this. And I stated, and as I continue to believe, that when I'm doing this, one, I'm not doing women a favor, and this has got to be inculcated in the minds of men, that when we give space to women, we are not doing them a favor, we are doing justice. And secondly, ours is not. Sometimes the problem with males is that even in these struggles of women to better themselves, we want to be the leaders, and to center ourselves. Our responsibility is to play a supportive role and listen. And this is the part that is very important, because we don't listen. We think that since we created the problems and we have the solutions at the same time, and we want to prescribe to them, and we label them when they make suggestions that we're uncomfortable with them. Our responsibility is to listen. Whether they're wrong or right is neither here nor there, but we must listen and engage them as equals. It's the same with the languages. It is very important to draw attention, and this is something that I've been trying to do, because there are many things that we take for granted. I'll just make quick three examples. When we speak about something that is beautiful, that is pure, and says in the case of love, I would explain to my interviewer that the love that I have for her is platonic, right? Platonic. It comes from somewhere. You see, language is a carrier of culture, and when we speak about crossing the Rubicon. The Rubicon is a history of some people, the Romans and all that, and we say that the measures that are used are draconian. It comes from Draco. And so it is very important then that when we try to advance, we were able to point to concrete examples about why it is important for languages that have been marginalized, so that people can be able to rediscover themselves, so that when you explain to people concepts in their own languages, especially those of us who are involved in struggles against, racial injustice, gender injustice, and all of that, you must be able to point out to the ordinary people that this concept exists in their language. And when you do so, the conversation becomes better. Just one example, I was talking to a friend that I don't call a person in my life a wife, because I don't know what that exactly means. But I call her umlingane. Umlingane comes from the word ukulingana in isiXhosa, which means an equal. So there was a conscious, move that when you are going to get married as a man, you are getting married to an equal. Mulikane kaSesotho, umlingane ngesiXhosa and in isiZulu. And languages then, for those of us who are involved in the struggles for justice in every aspect are useful to us in that regard.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.